And yeah, let's start off by saying, who was Hermes Trismegistus? Strangely enough, go back, I don't know, 1,000 years maybe, or even 600 or 1,000 or 1,500. If you ask that question in the right quarters, they might have said, what? Do you not know of the thrice great one? That's what Trismegistus means. He's great, great, great. There's, great as a philosopher, great as a sage, great as a magician, great as a creator, great of many, many, many things. When I was a kid growing up in the States, there was a breakfast cereal called Frosted Flakes. And the advert for it was this tiger. And he said, they're great, great, great. So he would have liked Hermes Trismegistus as well. And he's the figure in the middle here. And on the way to finding out or trying to answer this question, here's Hermes in one of the many images you can find on the net, or I got him. And he's in between two, well, perhaps, well, this one's certainly more, widely known. This is Mercury, or well, it's Mercury. Hermes has the cap, but it's the Roman Mercury has got the winged one more than the Greek. And he's the messenger of the gods. And, even today there's Hermes, the delivery service. So that gives you an idea. And he's also a figure you might see on banks. Because Hermes, the Greek Hermes and the Roman Mercury was sort of the patron god of bankers and merchants, also thieves. There's a connection there, and a variety of other things. And the other fellow here, we'll find out about a bit more, is the Egyptian god, well, Tahuti, but in the Greco, or the Hellenized version of it is Thoth. And this is the Egyptian god of writing, god of magic, god of, he's the scribe. If you know, in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, when one's soul is being weighed against the feather of Mat. Mat is the god of justice, the goddess of justice. And if your soul outweighs the feather, then you are eaten by this demon. And or if it balances fine, then you go on into the happy lands. And Thoth is there to take down the record, and he also leads one into the underworld. So this is kind of the provenance out of which we'll find down the road who Hermes Trismegistus was. And let's see. Okay, let's go. Oh, sorry. Let me get to. I'm not even showing the share screen. Am I yet? Am I? Are the images coming up? Okay, there we go. All right. Okay. So did you see any of this yet? No? Yes? You did?
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. Okay, so here's my quest for thrice greatest Hermes, and which is the subject of this book and more or less where this talk is coming out of. And the reason I was on a quest for Hermes Trismegistus is that, as I said, if you go back anytime earlier than our modern period, which we'll get around to, which say starts up in the 17th century, that question, there would have been an answer for that. He was this remarkable figure that people believed to have been a real live character, a person who lived in the ages way like some before the flood, the dawn of time, a contemporary of Moses, and so on and so on. We'll get on to, and it's only in very recent times, historically, that we recognize him to be a mythological figure or a literary invention, as it were, of some people, not at the dawn of time, but far back for us, a millennia or so, or two actually back. And this is a wonderful illustration from Manly P. Hall's book, The Secret Teaching of All Ages. If you know this book, that came out in the 1920s, it's a perennial. It's been in print ever since. It has these remarkable illustrations by Augustus Knapp of different esoteric and mythological and magical figures in that tradition. And this is one of Hermes Trismegistus in his most unforgettable role as the Egyptian. Throughout most of his career, let's say, Hermes Trismegistus was known just simply as the Egyptian. and he was supposed to have been the font of the Egyptian wisdom. That even for the Greeks, Egypt was old. Egypt's old for us, but even for the Greeks are old for us, but Egypt was old even then. So Egypt has been old for a very long time. And I won't be able to go into it this evening, but in the book, I do go into some detail trying to understand, well, what exactly is this Egyptian wisdom that everyone is supposed to have gone there, to go to school there, Plato, Pythagoras, so many others, and so on. But here he is. Here's Hermes as the Egyptian. He has the famous caduceus in his hand. This is this rod that has the winged rod with the twin serpents entwined around it. There's long stories, different versions of how that happened. The Greek prophet Tiresias was supposed to have seen two snakes battling, and he separated them with his rod, and then they became entwined around this, and then this became somehow a symbol for the mediating character of the prophet, the seer, and all that, and likewise with Hermes, who mediates between the underworld and our world as well. He's also holding, well, I should say here in the Egyptian context, the ibis was the bird that was very sacred to Thoth, the god we saw before. And in fact, so sacred that literally probably millions of them over the centuries were sacrificed and mummified as offerings to the god Thoth. We'll get onto that as well. And here's the emerald tablet. That's probably, if Hermes Trismegistus is not a name you're going to come across. People will have heard of Socrates or Plato. They never read any philosophy, but you wouldn't have heard of Hermes Trismegistus unless you were studying sort of the Western tradition, the magical tradition. But probably, even if you're just, should we say, skimming the surface of that, you might have heard of the emerald tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, which is this supposed stone, well, emerald tablet, as it were, on which was inscribed this famous hermetic teaching. And the one-liner everybody knows, as above, so below, comes from that. But we'll get onto that a bit later on. And then this is the serpent god, the Typhon, which represents the lower soul, the lower nature of human being, which Hermes, Thoth, here Hermes Trismegistus as the creator of civilization, the mind, the embodiment of mind overcomes. But to give you some idea of how important the figure Hermes Trismegistus was at one point in Western history, this is a tile from the Siena Cathedral, and we have Hermes Trismegistus here. I don't see it because of the sidebar, but he's pointing to an inscription from one of the works attributed to him called the Asclepius, that is part of the Corpus Hermeticum, which we'll get on to. And over here, one of these fellows is supposed to be Moses, and I think the other is another sort of, student of Hermes. And Hermes Trismegistus is actually teaching Moses here. He's passing some wisdom on. So there was a point in sort of late Renaissance 1500s in the church, Catholic Church, there was a movement within the church to get Hermes basically considered to be part of the fold. And this is the same time when Plato had been rediscovered in the Dark Ages, and a movement to have a Plato included as well. So there's a certain point, you don't always hear about this in the history, and even in the history of the Renaissance, which we'll get on to. But this figure who nobody knows about now, who was extremely important at a certain time, for a very long time, was as important to be considered, someone who handed wisdom onto Moses. So how many Hermes are there? Well, I didn't know that there was more than one Hermes until I started doing the reading for this book. But as I say in the beginning of the book, there turns out to be quite a few. There was a Hermes who lived before the flood, and before the flood happened, or knowing it was on its way, he inscribed his wisdom on these sort of tablets, usually kinds of things, and preserved these. And then when the flood receded, a second Hermes rediscovered those, and he had the wisdom again. And he passed it on to another who created the pyramids. There was a Hermes who invented the hieroglyphics. There was a Hermes who was a contemporary, but also a sort of teacher of Moses over here. He doesn't show up, although I don't know. I wonder if Yul Brynner is supposed to be a kind of, covert Hermes figure in there. He's the Egyptian. I know he's Pharaoh, but in any case, but like I said, there was a Hermes that was supposed to have been a contemporary of Moses and taught Moses. Was supposed to be early. Obviously, if he was for the flood, he was the contemporary of Noah. So it's as if a different character at different times has been named this, and in a way, it's almost a kind of title you take on in some ways, rather than a person that you are. But then again, we're talking about myth over different times, and we have the benefit of being able to look back and collecting all these different versions of stories about Hermes Trismegistus, which at the time, when people had these stories, they didn't have that benefit. So they didn't know what we know now. The Roman statesman Cicero said, there was 5 Hermes, and then there was one when he battled, he killed the many-eyed Argos in Greek mythology, and then after that battle, he passed his wisdom on. But there's this whole sort of notion about Hermes passing wisdom on, and you may be wondering why do I have a copy of the Wilhelm Bain's I Ching here, because in the 16th century or 15th century, I think 16th, a Jesuit father, Bouvet, who was a contemporary and correspondent of the German philosopher Leibniz, he believed that the I Ching, that Leibniz was one of the first Western thinkers to study the I Ching, well before it became a popular divinatory kind of, tool since the 1960s. And so even something as, let's say, foreign, I mean, Egypt is foreign from European mind, but something Chinese is even more foreign, let's say. But Hermes Trismegistus' accomplishments went far and wide. So, and I'm only now just touching on a few of the things that have been associated with this figure throughout the ages. And as I said, throughout most of his career, as it were, in the sense of references to him, historical references, he's generally always referred to as the Egyptian, as they say here in that wonderful shot of Yul Brynner. So, the Hermes Trismegistus that is part of this Western esoteric tradition that the Theosophical Society is a part of, and yes, I would even say, its founding in New York in 1875 was very hermetic, it hermetically informed, and with any luck, we'll get on to that. But so here he is in his kind of guise as the creative civilization, the master of magic, the first in the great chain of adepts, and the teacher of the perennial philosophy. Now, what do I mean by the first in the great chain of adepts? Well, Hermes Trismegistus became seen, as I said, someone who passed on his wisdom, his knowledge, and that student passed that on to the next, and then so on and so on. And at different times in Western, this kind of counter tradition, you have different kinds of, as we say, kind of a kind of chain of adepts, as it were. He taught him, and there's one at which Hermes is at the fount, and then I forget the name of the next one who was supposed to be taught, but then Pythagoras is in there at some point, and then Plato is in there as well, and then he passes it on, and so on and so on. I mean, again, when did that start? We'll get on to that, but it's an idea that was associated Hermes Trismegistus. And the perennial philosophy, or the Prisca Theologia, which I should have put in there, they're not quite the same, but they're very related. I mean, a very, very popular and relatively recent expression of that is, Aldous Huxley's famous book, The Perennial Philosophy. Huxley's Perennial Philosophy doesn't much, I haven't looked at it in years, or I'm sure it probably doesn't have any reference to Hermes at all. But the notion of perennial philosophy is that there's like a fundamental, basic truth, spiritual truth, or insight, out of which all of the great traditions, later emerged, and they all contain elements of it. And the reason why that's related to Hermes Trismegistus, we'll see historically, at this time here, when I was talking, when he was, scholars within the Christian tradition, within the Catholic tradition, wanted to incorporate Hermetic teaching, Platonic teachings. They wanted to do that because they had this multi-faith idea, what we would consider multi-faith. They had this notion that the fundamental ideas of Christianity and Judaism, and even Protestantism by there, and Islam, and the pagan philosophers, which for them were Plato and the teachings of Hermes. They all, at heart, had the same insight, and there was even evidence to suggest that Hermes, in some ways, was a precursor of Christ, and so on and so on. The Prisca Theology, this was a phrase coined by a churchman, Agostino Stucco, in the 1500s, precisely in order to argue that we can bring Plato in, we can bring these, great pagan, not pagan, Celt pagan going out to Stonehenge, but pagan in the sense of Greek, teachings. They realized that they were important, that they shouldn't be just jettisoned. And there was a time, about a century and a half, when that was a possibility. So that's kind of, how should we say, his who he is in terms of this tradition that is still around today. I mean, it's a popular. It's not nothing that's recognized. It's not anything that's recognized in any way, like modern science or whatever that is. But it's part of the popular kind of culture, and we'll get on to that. So when did all this start? Okay, well, although people up until about the mid 1600s believed that Hermes Trismegistus was a real person that did live, before the flood, and that his wisdom was the wisdom that Plato learned from, or later greats, and even Jesus did, and so on and so on. It most likely got started in Alexandria in the early, maybe 100, 200, whatever. I mean, probably 200 or 300s. That era of our modern era, the Christian era, in a place that, according to the novelist Lawrence Durrell, in his Alexandria Quartet, which is not contemporary, it's 1940s, sort of post-war, around there, I think. I'm not sure. Novel set in Alexandria. It has echoes of Gnostic and sort of Egyptian motifs in the background. But he calls it a city of sects and gospels. And that means that at this place, Alexandria, there was a proliferation of different religious and philosophical and spiritual teachings on offer, much like today. Much like today, the sort of spiritual marketplace that we have today, and even more so on the internet. And Alexandria was founded in 331 BC by Alexander the Great, although he never saw it. What he did was he said, build it here. And that was because he read, he was a great reader of Homer. I mean, there probably wasn't that much else to read. Maybe Aristotle was his teacher. But Homer described this harbor and this island, the Pharos, off the coast, off that coast, where there wasn't anything there, or there was just a small Egyptian settlement. And then in a dream, Homer was supposed to have come to Alexandria and said, build your city there. So he went and he marked it all out, and he said, there's the harbor, there's that, this, that. But then he went off to find new worlds to conquer. And let me see, I think he died about 10 years later, maybe something like that, if very young. So he never saw it. But it became the center of civilization in the West at that time, and rivaled Rome. It was the second largest city at its height later on. And it's most famous for the library, famous library of Alexandria, and the lighthouse, the Pharos. And as I like to say in the book, they are twin symbols of illumination, you can say. You know, there's enlightenment in the writings of the scholars, which contained original works by people like Euclid, Archimedes of Eureka fame, Aristarchus, Eratosthenes, Ptolemy. I mean, these are people whose names are, you know, in our history. Sadly, we'll get onto it. The library was destroyed. Innumerable works were lost. You know, we can't even begin to understand what that loss was. And the lighthouse lasted until about the 1300s, and it eventually, you know, was completely destroyed, you know, over a series of time, centuries, through earthquakes and things of that sort. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But as I said, it was a city of sects and gospels, and this is only a small sample of the different sort of religions that were on hand. There was early Christianity, and this is some of the early Christian symbols, about the fish symbols and so on and so on. So they'd be scribed on the walls, and you'd be able to find, you know, this way to the meeting, kind of thing. This is not, this is from the time, this is a much later illustration, but this is the Gnostic Sophia. So the Gnostics, they were the kind of competitors. They were at the time, this is before the Petrine Church really had, you know, taken hold. It's certainly well before the Roman Church. So in Alexandria, there was sort of what became the literal Christian church, the church today, you know, broken up into hundreds of sects anyway. But then at the time, the competitors were the Gnostics, who considered themselves the true Christians, but they had a much more symbolic and, what we might say, you know, esoteric understanding of the Gospels. And if you know the Gnostic Gospels, you know, you understand that and all that. But you also have, you know, this Judaism was a very living tradition there. Philo of Alexandria was a brilliant Jewish sage who interpreted the Jewish writings symbolically, not literally. I mean, they had, you know, at the time, what we would call symbolic, esoteric kind of reading of ancient sacred scripture, as opposed to the early Christians, the Petrine Christians that took it literally. That was happening then. But even in, you know, Judaic, this is Plotinus. You have all the Neoplatonic philosophies going on there. And over here, this is an example of what was very indicative of what was happening there. It was a very tolerant atmosphere there. And one of the things that happened is that Alexandria, you know, was Greek Egypt, Hellenistic Egypt. Whatever his faults, Alexander the Great enabled, you know, Greek teaching, Greek knowledge and culture to spread over the known world. And the Egypt that Alexandria, you know, emerged, you know, and became great in was this Hellenistic Egypt. And after Alexander's death, it was ruled by the Ptolemies. The last Ptolemy was Cleopatra. And then it was, you know, Roman Egypt. And at that point, you know, it was Roman and you know, who was ruling a Greek in culture. But the whole atmosphere in terms of religion was very tolerant. You not only had all of these different sects operating at the same time, but you had this kind of syncretism where different gods would merge together. So this is Serapis, and Serapis was a Hellenized version of 2 Egyptian gods, Osiris and Apis, coming together. And he's very, very popular. So there were many temples to, you know, Serapis and things of that sort. And that's important because that's where Hermes Trismegistus comes out. It was out of that atmosphere. So in Hellenized Alexandria, you have the ancient Egyptian religious figures, Thoth. His worship goes back probably to about 3000 BC. Hermopolis, it's a Hellenized version of this city that was founded in honor and worship of Thoth at one of the oldest sites of a city settlement. As I said, the ibis was sacred to him, and that, you know, literally millions of these poor animals were mummified as offerings. He was a god of writing, god of civilization, god of magic. He was a moon god. He shared the bark with Isis as you know, Ra's royal bark, and on the way to the sun, and so on. And he lined up quite nicely with Hermes. This is more of a Greek Hermes, not because he doesn't have the wings on the helmet. He still has the caduceus there, and his cloak, and these are sort of the kind of signature attire to Hermes. And Hermes, I mean, they're both psychopomps. They both lead the souls into the underworld. Hermes was god. He was a messenger. He was god of communication. He was god of writing. He invented. They're both sort of inventor gods. They're both civilizing gods. I mean, that's their kind of power. So unlike Zeus, it isn't like thunderbolts or, you know, some kind of, you know, terrific superpower. We would say they're very wise and knowledgeable, and they pass this on to humans. And what happens is, in this soup in Alexandria at the time, where everyone's very relaxed about the gods all kind of getting together, they blend together and they become Hermes Trismegistus. Exactly when, we don't know. There's a variety of different periods and times offered as, you know, when this might have happened. The Greek historian Herodotus said around the 5th century BC, he was already referring to, you know, a Hermes Trismegistus and all that. So, I mean, in the book, you know, I offer various different where and whens that, you know, a variety of different scholars have offered, but it's kind of, and all these sorts of things, it's shrouded in the misty past, so we don't quite know. But at a certain point, he was accepted as this figure. And what did that mean? Well, Hermes Trismegistus, thrice greatest Hermes, was supposed to have been the author of these writings called the Corpus Hermeticum. And they are philosophical, sort of mystical, metaphysical, incantatory, ecstatic, and some are outright very magical. There's one called the Asclepius that became notorious in the Christian period because it was always pointed to as sort of the source of black magic, and because it talked the Egyptian magic and the whole idea of being able to make to animate statues. That was one of the things. Asclepius taught how you could draw down the stellar influences and animate things, and this is supposed to be something only God could do, and so on and so on. So things of that sort. But rather than that path, we're going to follow this other one that most of the texts in the Corpus Hermeticum are concerned with, and it is this notion of gnosis, cosmic consciousness, religion of the mind, and the journey through the planets to the 8th sphere. That sounds like there should be a Netflix, you know, program about the 8th sphere. But what does all that mean? Well, gnosis is a Greek word for knowledge, but it's a peculiar kind of knowledge. It's not like episteme, which is another Greek word for knowledge, which was the knowledge from experience or learning, you know, epistemology, the philosophical study of how we know things. I mean, you know, how do I know that the Earth goes around the sun, or how do I know that 2 + 2 is 4, or how do I know, you know, whatever, that kind of thing. But gnosis is something else. It's a more direct, immediate kind of revelatory knowledge in some way that it has a transformative effect. And in this context, and this is what I mentioned the Gnostics before, and I said some of the competing religion philosophical movements at the time. They too were interested in gnosis. This is what separated them from the Petrine Church, is that rather than accept on faith or take literally, you know, Jesus's crucifixion and a variety of other things, they read it in a symbolic kind of way, and in the sense that it was all about having an experience like Christ rather than like, oh yes, I believe that happened, and as long as I believe that, I'll get into heaven. It wasn't like that. So they too were interested in gnosis, but and in fact, if you know about the Nag Hammadi Gnostic texts that were discovered in the 1940s, it's sort of the same thing around like the Dead Sea Scroll. These were these texts that were written around this time and had been stowed away somewhere in an urn or something, buried. And these, I don't know, shepherds, I'm trying to remember exactly, came across them and discovered them. And then Elaine Pagel's wonderful book, The Gnostic Gospels, and her other writings. But amidst those, there were some Hermetic texts. And the thing is, they were both sought this kind of knowledge, this gnosis, but they had sort of different, as you can say, kind of metaphysical views. The Gnostics were a bit paranoid. Gnostics are more paranoid than the Hermeticists, put it that way. And today a lot of our popular culture, on Netflix and things of that sort, and The Matrix and a variety of different conspiracy consciousness, and we all live in a simulation or something like that. These are all very Gnostic kind of views because they believe that we live in a false world, and so on and so on. And the Hermeticists weren't paranoid, but they did believe that somehow, well, what had happened, to sort of just skip over to Journey Through the Planets. I mean, in the Hermetic creation myth, there's nous. Nous is mind in Greek. So the mind, the mind at large, as Aldous Huxley called it in his book Doors of Perception. Just kind of the fundamental, primal, consciousness, spirit of whatever, everything. Wants to create a world. So, and as in many of these myths, that mind doesn't do it itself. He calls in somebody else, a demiurge or a creator god to do that. In the Gnostic myth, what happens is the creator god, he goes well beyond his brief, and he forgets that he's only been called in to do the job, and he starts to believe that he's the true god, and then he creates this false world in which the rest of us have to escape to get back to the real God behind him. It's not quite the same with Hermetic. What happens is that, okay, the craftsman says, yes, I'll do that. But in order to do that, I have to bring some of my friends in. I have to outsource a little bit. And so the craftsman brings in 7 forces, and they're the 7 planets, the 7 ancient planets. And their energies are used to create the Earth. You have to remember, this is back at a time when Earth was considered the center of the universe. So we're at the center of things, and everything's radiating up like that, or radiating down to us, and as in this image here. And so in order to create the Earth and nature and the world of life and all of that, the craftsman has to draw on energies and forces from the 7 planets. And then the next thing is, in order to show off, or basically, hey, look, see what I've done, nous creates man, and it means human, but I know it doesn't mean male. It means, human, anthropos, or whatever, just us. And look what I've done. And we became so enamored of the handiwork of nature. Basically, we fall in love with nature, natural world, and we fall through the planets. Okay, here we're here, and we kind of go woo, 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 bang, and along the way, like a pinball machine. Along the way, someone should make a pinball machine of that. Or a pinball machine dates me incredibly, but along the way, we acquire characteristics from all those planets, all those forces, necessary individually in order to create things, but they build up in us, and we forget our source, back up in the one and all that. And then the Hermetic journey is through a variety of different ecstatic, meditative practices and exercises in imagination, in expanding your consciousness. That's the cosmic consciousness bit. I mean, they didn't call it cosmic consciousness, but G.R.S. Mead, as you probably know, was Madame Blavatsky's secretary in her last days. He was a wonderful Hermetic and Gnostic scholar and Neoplatonic scholar and all that. But he was aware of this book by R.M. Buck that came out in the early 20th century, 1901, called Cosmic Consciousness. And I've talked about that in other talks for the Theosophical Society here, and talks about my book, Secret History of Consciousness. Because the kinds of experiences described by in these writings, and presumably, had by people participating in them, are very much along the same lines as the kinds of experiences Buck talks about in this book about cosmic consciousness, which is about the human race evolving into a higher state of consciousness. And I should point out that we don't know who these people were. We have no information about the Hermetists. We don't know their names. The Gnostics we know, the Basilides and Hippocrates and Valentinus, and they signed their texts. They signed their own name. The Hermeticists, they signed either Hermes Trismegistus or Tat or other figures, students of Hermes. So they were anonymous, much like the craftsmen in the Middle Ages working on the Gothic cathedrals. We don't know who they are. We don't know why they did that. It's strange, but we don't know who they are. And I have a book called The Secret Teachers of the Western World. And when you look at it, the very fundamental, the heart of, the founding myth of this tradition, they were secret teachers because we don't know who they were. We don't know, it's one of those strange things. But in any case, Mead saw what they were trying to do to release or transform or become free of the heavy influences of the planets. And it wasn't to escape the world in the way the Gnostics wanted to, but it was to free ourselves of these limitations and then to take our rightful place within the world, because we are caretakers. In a book I wrote, Caretakers of the Cosmos, for the Hermeticists. But the journey is back or through the planets to the eighth sphere, which is a realm that's beyond. It's not materialized. It's not manifest. It's a I don't know, like the Buddhist Sunyata or the Gnostic Pleroma, or the Kabbalistic Ein Sof, or some non-manifest realm. But it's interior. These are interior journeys. They're not going up in space with these millionaires or billionaires these days are flying up for 10 seconds. No, they're taking interior journeys. Into the source. The source is within the mind. That's why it's the religion of the mind. Okay, so what happens? Well, all that goes on for a few centuries with all the other pagan, groups or early Christian groups, Neoplatonism as such. But with Christianity becoming the official religion of Roman Empire, the party's over. Pagans are remarkably tolerant. I've yet to come across any, evidence that, like, yes, the followers of whatever, Serapis went and beat up the Neoplatonics. I mean, you don't see that, but it's these very intolerant religions like Christianity, and also we'll see, Islam later on. The first thing they do, well, the Christians have been persecuted, but the first thing they do pretty much is when they get into power, they start persecuting. They start biting the one below them. And this is Saint Theophilus. After, I think it was the Emperor Theodosius who banned paganism. And he ordered the destruction of all the temples. So he carried out in Alexandria the destruction of temples to Serapis, temples to Mithras, the Mithraic religious belief was actually a heavy contender to early Christianity, much like the Gnostics. And then most infamously, Saint Cyril, who's the patriarch, he was the patriarch of Alexandria. He was the other patriarch of Alexandria. He had it in, for the pagan philosophers, for the Hermeticists, for the Greeks, all of them. And famously, he egged on a crowd of early pagan fanatics to murder outright, assassinate Hypatia. Hypatia is this brilliant woman of, late antiquity. She was one of the last great teachers in the Platonic Academy. She was politically influential at the time. That's why Cyril wanted her out of the way. And so he egged on these kind of real, high octane fundamentalist Christians. And when she was coming back, from the library of Alexandria, or wherever it was, or the academy, she was just pulled down out of a chariot, dragged into, some space, and just packed, murdered. They say they scraped the skin off her body with shells and burned her, and so on and so on. And effectively, that's the end of the pagan kind of world. But a century or so later on, we have Justinius first, and he closes down the Platonic Academy. So that's pretty much it for then. Okay, so that happens, and when all this is going on in Alexandria, I have up here the pagan the diaspora. You have hermetic scholars and Neoplatonic scholars, and not the Christians. The Christians are, well, the Petrine Christians, not the Gnostics, the Petrine Christians. And later on, Alexandria goes like, it gets even worse when Islam is on the rise, and Emir ibn Alsace, this famous sack of Alexandria, I think it's around 629. Here's a painting of it, and it's probably apocryphal, but the story is that they get to the library and the soldiers say, "But what should we do with all the books?" And he says, "Well, if they repeat what the Quran says, they're superfluous. If they say something different than the Quran, they're heresy. So we don't need them in either way. Burn them to heat the baths for the soldiers." So that's probably apocryphal, but that was kind of the idea. In any case, by that time, the library had already been burnt by accident, Julius Caesar, much earlier, and a few other times. But many, scholars, they took what they could. They took what they could, and they left. And the kind of, again, even though this is later than that as well, but here, I mean, the beginning of, we're not supposed to call them the Dark Ages, but I call them the dim ages, if we can't call them the dark ages. When you have the last Roman emperor here, Romulus Augustus, he concedes defeat to Odoacer, who's the king of Italy, and that's the end of the Roman Empire. But it's also the beginning of this time where what was, I mean, for all its faults, exactly the same thing with Alexander. Of course, these horrible people go and conquer other people, but they do create what we call civilization. They do create, means of communication. There's roads, and there's laws and all that. All that's dying, that's gone, that's rotting, it's falling apart, it's breaking apart. And the West has basically gone into sleep for a while. So what happens? Well, many people from Alexandria go to a place called Haran, which doesn't exist anymore. It was obliterated, I think, around 1271 by the Mongols, if I'm not mistaken. But back in the day, it was a very, well-known, I think it means crossroads itself. It was a famous city along different trade routes. I think it turns up as in the Bible, if I'm not mistaken. And there's a famous story about people have gone there who are followers of Hermes Trismegistus. They're followers of the writings of the Corpus Hermeticum. Now, one of the things that happens along the Dark Ages, we lose Plato, we lose all this stuff, but we also lose the Corpus Hermeticum. It just sinks into obscurity, and here and there you hear bits and pieces of these texts turning up somewhere. That's same thing with Plato and all that, but it's a long, like I said, probably about, let's say, almost a millennia, where they don't really surface. There's little kind of blips of people mention them, half mention them somewhere, or they mention a few of them, until we'll get on to the Renaissance, when they're rediscovered again. So these writings, they were supposed to influence Plato and everybody else, and Jesus and Moses. We don't know where they are anymore, and we don't know who these Hermeticists were. We have no idea anything about them, other than many of them went here. And we know one reason we know that they went there is that during all the different conquests and battles going on, top of my head, I forget the name of the caliph who winds up at Haran at one point, and he asks the local people, "What is your religion?" And they say, we are Hermeticists. Or they say we are Heranians, and they say, "Well, what does that mean?" And basically, he says to them, "Look, I'm on my way there, wherever he was going, but you have to decide if you have to be somebody of the book. You have to decide whether you're, Islam or Christian or Jewish or one of the religions, one of the teachings that is mentioned in the book, in the Bible." He said, I'll be back. And if you don't do that when I come back, I will have to slaughter all of you. I'm sorry. No, don't take it personally, but this is my job. And so they consult these Islamic jurists, people who understand the law. And one of them suggests that they call themselves Sabians. And these are people that are in the Bible, and they're supposed to be followers of Enoch. And Enoch is one of these later apocryphal kind of prophets, but he is recognized by Islam as supposed to be equivalent of Idris. And he's also somebody who's associated with Hermes Trismegistus. So Hermes Trismegistus is supposed to be the same. And if you know Enoch, he's the master of wisdom and all these, things and that sort of thing. And so when the caliph comes back, and he asks them, "Who are you?" And he said, we are followers of this. And they said, Idris Enoch Hermes is our prophet, and our book is the Corpus Hermeticum, and And he says, "Okay." So being followers of Hermes Trismegistus actually saved their life. But on a kind of intellectual or what do you want to call it, mystical trade route, some of the sort of pagans there, they move on to Baghdad. And Baghdad has become a kind of second Alexandria. It's a great center of learning. There's the House of Wisdom. This is the Baghdad of Harun al-Rashid in the Arabian Nights. And there, this kind of pagan wisdom is tolerated for a while. Only for a while, but again, just as later in Christianity, it'll be the same thing. Because the scholars, the intelligent people recognize that, we can't burn this stuff. We can't destroy this stuff. This is, brilliant, whatever it is, and again, it's not just the Hermetic teachings, it's the Platonic, it's also everything else that the people who knew what was on its way took from the library, brought with them, This is one of the, if you study any history of this kind of thing, one of the things that's always happening is that the scholars are the ones who save all these things and carry it away from the city that's going to be sacked. But you may be wondering why I haven't talked about alchemy really at all in the talk, and because Hermes, the Hermetic art, is considered alchemy and all that. And as I said earlier, probably if anyone knows the name of a Hermetic text or an alchemical text, it would be the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus. And here's a famous illustration of it. Again, as I say, it has as above, so below. But there is no Greek original, and it does not turn up in the Corpus Hermeticum. And in fact, there's no alchemy in the Corpus Hermeticum. In Alexandria at the time, when the Corpus Hermeticum is thought to have been written, or those texts thought to have been written, there was alchemy, and alchemists were aware of the Hermetic teaching. Zosimus of Alexandria was around that time. Jung has a lecture series about him, his importance. He was aware of the Hermetic writings, and he incorporates some in some of his own. But there wasn't a kind of return. There's no mention of alchemy in any of the Corpus Hermeticum, even in Asclepius, which is the magical one. This is something that becomes associated with Hermes during the time when Hermetic teachings have gone into the Arab world. And just one person to stand for many brilliant Arab Islamic scholars and alchemists and spiritual explorers is Jabir, whose I guess the Europeanized name is Geber. Unfortunately, the word gibberish is in our language because they didn't understand what the alchemical texts were about. Well, do we today? I don't know. But the first historical, sighting of the Emerald Tablet, or writing supposedly of the tablet, is in a collection of Jabirs. And this is, I think, around the 7th century. My date's off a little bit, but around there. So it's not part of this this teaching. It isn't part of the Corpus Hermeticum is about these visionary experiences of cosmic consciousness. It's not about the Philosopher's Stone. It's not about, turning, lead into gold or anything like that. That will be later on when alchemy comes back into the West. I can't tell that story, but that's what will happen. But eventually, these texts that have passed through, hands over centuries in battles, they wind up in Constantinople. And again, it's precisely a war. It's precisely, rapine and ravage and looting that propels this knowledge back into the world. Because after many, many years, what happens in 1453 is that Constantinople falls to the Turk. And as often happens, as I said, the scholars are fleeing these places and they're selling these texts in order to, fuel their exit. And what precipitates this is this fellow here, very important character, Gemistes Plethon. Most people don't know about him at all. He was a Byzantine scholar, and he lived in a city called Mistra, which doesn't exist anymore. But at the time, it was an important another center of learning in Macedonia, in that part of the world, Eastern Europe over there. And he's important because he was in the split. By this time, there were, Constantinople was the Eastern Rome. There was the Rome in Italy, and then there was Constantinople set up. I'm trying to remember the dates or how far the difference between when the two Constantinople and Alexandria. Much later on, it's Emperor Constantine and all that. So, but it's that side of the empire, the Eastern Empire, let's say, or the Eastern Church, is still thriving, whereas the Roman Church or the European has fallen into the Dark Ages. But in around the 1400s, mid 1400s, 15th century, the Turk is advancing ever closer every day on Constantinople. And there's a mission sent to the East. By this time, you have the Holy Roman Empire and all that. It's got back up on its feet, to ask for help. And there's something called the Council of Ferrara. It happens around 1439 into the 1440s. But Gemistes Plethon is sent there because he's a brilliant scholar. He's a brilliant dialectician. He's a statesman, and he's there to plead the case, that Rome should send help to, keep the Turk at bay. And while he's at this council, he gives a series of talks. And one person in the audience is Cosimo de' Medici, who's the great power broker of Florence at the time. And Gemistes is one of these people who, as I said before, he knows of this idea of this chain of adepts. And it's not Hermes Trismegistus for him, for Zoroaster. Zoroaster is the founder of Zoroastrianism, the great Persian sage. Again, there's many different dates of when he would have existed if he was one person. But at the time, he was supposed to be, he was thought to have been the author of a series of ecstatic kind of mystical writings known as the Chaldean oracles. And there's a whole mystical sort of visionary tradition behind those as well. But he was at the font, at the head of this chain of adepts for Platon. So the Zoroaster, then whoever, he handed it down to the next and next. And nobody in the West had heard any of this kind of thing. I mean, one of the things, the difference between the West and the East Church is that in the East, people like Plato, people like the Greek teachings, that there was more of it around. So the scholar, and they knew Greek. I mean, in the West, people didn't know Greek. I mean, that was something, we'll get to him very soon here, Marsilio Ficino. But Cosimo was really, he's somebody who he wanted to read all of Plato before he died, and he had book scouts out all over the place. And what had happened is with the fall, well, the council, it wasn't a success. The West didn't send any armies to help Constantinople. Constantinople fell to the Turks. The Church of the Holy Sophia became a mosque. Scholars fleeing the carnage sold off these texts they had, in order to pay. And Cosimo de' Medici had a book scout there who got a hold of some stuff. It was some Plato, some this, some that. But Cosimo decided, okay, he wanted somebody who could translate the Greek into Latin so that he could read it. And luckily, around him was a young Greek scholar, Marsilio Ficino, who's this character here. And he set up a new Platonic academy in the hills around Florence. And he put, Ficino in the chair, and he said, okay, here's all this Plato, whatever it was, translate that. I want to read it, But then very soon he said, stop the presses, hold everything. Put Plato on the back burner, translate this. And this was the Corpus Hermeticum. So one of Cosimo's book scouts found a monk or a scholar or whatever, fleeing the Turks in Constantinople who had, that was one place where it went to at the end of that last, let me see. Yeah, down here. That's one place where we can trace the text that went there. There was a fellow named Michael Sellis in the, I think, 10th century. I may date software. A collection of writings that have the Corpus Hermeticum together there. He mentions them, he talks about them, and so on and so on. So Marsilio Ficino translates that. He's a wonderful Greek scholar. He's one of the people who's responsible for this attempt to have Platonic ideas enter into the church. And they're saying, Platonism, it's kind of a precursor to Christianity. Hermeticism is sort of a precursor to Christianity. There's many similarities and so on and so on. And he sparks what we can call the Hermetic Renaissance. And the Renaissance we know is about, the rediscovery of Plato and all that. But as Frances Yates, the great historian, said in her books on this subject, it's also very much about the rediscovery of Hermetic writings. And just one, example of that is the Primavera, Botticelli's Primavera, which is full of what we could call Hermetic talismans. One of the things Marsilio Ficino did, he didn't only translate the text, he basically put them into action. He more or less invented what we understand as astrology today, and how this was the magical side of the Corpus Hermeticum, and how we can draw down. The word influence basically comes from astrology, comes from this fluid coming down from the stars. That, the mage knows how to, we are subject to it like puppets, but if we know how to maneuver these different energies through talismanic symbols and a variety of different colors and correspondences and sense and all this time, he developed a whole kind of what we call a kind of psychotherapy, a kind of magical psychotherapy, where if you could afford it, if you could deck out your place with a variety of different talismanic objects, you could attract beneficial stellar forces and repel bad ones. And then also this whole vision, you look at Michelangelo's Adam is like, the Middle Age Adam was, oh God, I screwed up, I'm horrible, it's sinful kind of thing. And the vision of humanity, at least from the church in the West in the Middle Ages, that we're all wretched, sinful creatures, and oh my God, and the world is evil. Every little rustling of a leaf might be Satan, and all this kind of thing. And this vision was sort of transformed by the revival of Platonic learning, but also the Hermetic learning, because the Hermetic texts teach us how to use the forces, and they're not evil. And this is one of the things that actually Marsilio was. Ficino, he's saying, this is good magic. There's natural magic, and the church accepted it for a while, healing things, using beneficial herbs and that kind of stuff. What it didn't like was the stellar kind of stuff, because that seemed to be, God's place. But that didn't bother Pico della Mirandola, who, a very young man, wrote his famous oration on the dignity of man. He basically completely challenged the old, medieval view of wretched humanity. But he was another one who wanted to incorporate. They're Christian. They're very faithful, believing Christians, but they want to bring in the Platonic ideas. They want to bring the Hermetic. He wanted to bring in Kabbalistic ideas as well. And it's this notion of the perennial philosophy, the Prisca theology. All of these faiths and religion can get together. They all have a common kind of bond. And someone who kind of went to the limit at the time is Giordano Bruno. And he not only believed in this dignity of man, this kind of transformative power of human creativity, but he wanted to revive the ancient Egyptian teachings and basically kind of eclipse Christianity at the time. I kind of took it too far. But he's he's, he was executed 1600, I think, in the Campo di Fiore in Rome. But that's usually said he was executed because he was a proponent of Copernicus's heliocentric, vision of the solar system rather than the Ptolemaic. But Earth is at the center. Earlier picture we saw, and the concentric spheres rise above us. This is no, sun's at the center, and we spin around it. He did, but not so much. It was more about he because that at that point wasn't actually considered heretical. But what Giordano Bruno emphasized was that there were infinite worlds, that the universe was infinite, extended in all directions and all that. And this was something that the church fathers couldn't accept. They liked a nice Ptolemaic view, like we're here, there's da-da-da-da-da, then there's heaven, it's about it. But this actually itself is a hermetic kind of theme, or archetype, Jung might say, because in the Corpus Hermeticum and other hermetic writings, the sun is central. The sun is kind of the center of things. It's a kind of focal point for a variety of different things. So, and Newton down the line, he steeped in the hermetic writings, and he wrote more about alchemy than he did about gravity. And gravity itself is a unseen occult force, because no one's ever seen it. So, but what happens? Well, the party's over after a couple centuries. I said before, we have Hermes here, teaching Moses, and there's a variety of different forces within the church trying to get all that accepted. But at the same time, we have the rise of Protestantism. And one of the main arguments of Protestantism against the Catholic Church is precisely kind of magic, the practice of indulgences, where priests, for a certain amount of money, you pay me, or you don't pay me, but you make a contribution to the church, and I'll make sure, something goes well for your uncle or husband or whatever in purgatory, or something. So the priest has magic powers. He can intercede, for you with God or whoever. It might be Virgin Mary, whatever. There's, again, much like in the magical tradition where there's different kind of spirits and so on, in the Catholic tradition, there are all these kind of, intermediary, spirits that you can get on your side and all that. But, the Protestant don't want that at all. No, it's like, this is all rubbish. This is some magic. This is like, the priest can't make some magic passes and make everything better for me. And at the same time, precisely as we say, the energizing of the human spirit that was behind the Renaissance also gave birth to the spirit of humanism, which is fundamentally a kind of urbane, critical way of reading these texts. And in a sense, we could say it's more Latin or Roman than it is Greek. In a very simple sense, the Greek texts tend to be kind of more ecstatic and over the top, and the Latin tends to be more calm and bring, calm everything down, with the rise of humanist scholarship, and particularly in this fellow here, Isaac Casaubon, who was considered, the wisest man at the time, and in the context of the battle between Protestantism and the Counter-Reformation, he was asked to basically write a critical account or a critique of the English actually trying to strike a bargain between the two opposite sides to reach the middle. He was asked to write a critical history or a critical account of a famous history of the church, in which Hermes Trismegistus is referred to as precisely, someone in this kind of context and status of a great, fount of wisdom from which the church, profited. And what he found, because he was a very good scholar, was that the Greek in which this Corpus Hermeticum that was rediscovered by, Cosimo de Medici's book scout, could not have been the Greek of this time before Plato. So Hermes Trismegistus is supposed to have influenced Plato, so he must have been earlier than Plato. But the texts that Plato was supposed to have read, the Greek they were written in was a Greek that was much earlier, was much later than Plato's own Greek. So it just textually, it couldn't be the case. So basically they said, no, this is about from the period that we said from Alexandria. This is not from the dawn of time. This isn't from Moses. This isn't before Homer. It's not from then. And he more or less said there were a group of enthusiasts at the time that they put together a pious fraud, that they somehow to, I should say, bolster or give support to the early Christian movement. They wrote these texts as a kind of precursor to Christianity to show, like, oh, it's on its way, kind of thing. And today, there's a lot of debate about this, and some people say, oh, all the Egyptian kind of stuff that is in the Corpus Hermeticum, it's all kind of window dressing. But others say no, the Platonism that's supposed to be behind it, because it's turned the other way around. Rather than Hermes influencing Plato, the Hermetic texts are full of Platonic influence and all that. But as said before, if Plato went to school in Egypt, insofar as he inherited some Egyptian wisdom, then that wisdom that the later Egyptians got from Plato would have been Egyptian in some ways to begin with. So the debate is still open. But that's at this point, and this is 1614, that Hermes Trismegistus loses his credibility as a source of wisdom and all that. And what happens at that point, strangely enough, is in 1614. This advertisement did come out then. I put this in because this was something I used to see in the back of magazines or comic books when I was a kid. But in Kassel in Germany in 1614, this is when the appearance of the Rosicrucian pamphlets, the Rosicrucian manifestos. Who are the Rosicrucians? Well, the Rosicrucians were the strange, mysterious, secret teachers. No one could ever find them. They were known as the Invisibles because everyone wanted to meet them, but never could ever find them. But then they called for people to come and join them because they had this vision of reshaping, the political map, but also the spiritual and intellectual and religious map of Europe at the time. Certainly the Habsburg Empire at the time. They are sort of like the first kind of modern secret society, and at the same time that they appear, that the Hermetic wisdom goes underground because it's been dethroned. It's not like overnight. Nobody knew, hardly anybody knew what Kassabin did. This was, took time. And some years later, it was an all-out attack on the Hermetic vision or Hermetic view by this French theologian, priest. He's a philosopher, kind of religious thinker, Marin Mersenne. He was a friend and contemporary of Descartes. And Descartes, we know, is one of the ones to sort of separate mind and the world. The Hermetic view, it isn't separated. We participate. This is why magic can happen. This is why we can, what happens from the stars, the influence from the stars plays out in our lives and things of that sort. But Descartes, in order to establish certainty, the philosopher, he wanted to establish what can I know without any doubt whatsoever, and he came to the only thing he could possibly know without any doubt is that his own mind. He existed in that way, but everything else he basically understood to be some kind of machine or something that was just purely happened through cause and effect. The early mechanical kind of view. Marin Mersenne went to town with that completely and utterly attacked late Hermetic thinkers, Rosicrucian thinkers like Robert Fludd, is a great English mystic, but also cosmic kind of thinker. I mean, it's not, again, this Hermetic thing is not so much about alchemy, it's about microcosm, macrocosm. It's about the vision of human beings as somehow containing the whole universe. And this was the end result of the journey through the planets. When you reach the eighth sphere, you become the microcosm. So you're no longer just one thing among other things in the universe. You become a universe yourself. But he had an all-out attack on it. And at the same time, he was a proponent of the early scientific view. So it was a strange, weird thing at this time where a theologian, a fervent, fanatical Christian, joins forces with this rising science, which soon enough they would become enemies themselves. But in order to completely undermine the Hermetic kind of teaching, and what happens at Hermes goes underground just very quickly. I mean, the whole what we know as occultism and all of that today comes out of that, and you get Freemasonry comes out of that. Swedenborg is a student of Hermeticism. Blake is a student of Swedenborg. He's also a student of Hermeticism. Yeats is a student of Blake. Yeats joins the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, but before that, he joins the Theosophical Society in Dublin. And Madame Blavatsky's book, I mentioned it earlier, I was alluding to it, Isis Unveiled. This is the first modern repackaging of the Hermetic wisdom. And she's trying to show, as did someone like Flood and the Rosicrucians, that there isn't necessarily an antithesis between the Hermetic wisdom and the rising natural science when they could work together. You know, just as there isn't necessarily antithesis between it and the church and traditional teaching, they could work together. But the fanaticism on the other side, they said, no, we don't want you. But she repackaged it. And, you know, Isis Unveiled is, you know, before she turned her compass east, it's towards Egypt. And there's the Hermetic Order of Luxor and all that. Aleister Crowley, he was in the same club as Yeats, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn got a lot of, you know, it's character from Eliphas Levi, who's the, you know, the great French occultist in the 19th century, and Madame Blavatsky borrowed from him as well. This is only a brief kind of like bang, because what happens is the Hermetic teaching with the Rosicrucians, it goes underground. And just here, this is just a quick thing I just picked up the net. That's a production of Mozart's Magic Flute. Back then, at the time, even then, the Hermetic teaching was in popular culture. You know, it was it lost this prestige, like we say, as we say in the highbrow, whatever intellectual culture, but it stayed within the popular culture, and that's the same today. Where is Hermes Trismegistus today? Well, you can find him in Katy Perry. Here's a video of hers called Dark Horse. It's full of, you know, Hermetic influences. And here's Crowley again in his early days in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and there's David Bowie. He's a big fan of Crowley. And, you know, his I forget which rap singer that is, Ciara, I think. You know, she's Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and here's Crowley and Jay-Z. So Hermes is still around. He's still there. He's in the popular world. He's not in the world, you know, of academia, anything like that, except for, you know, the academic esoteric writing. But you can find him most times. So there you go. Thank you very much. And I hope you appreciate it. Thank you very much.